Are you looking for video settings that will help you make cinematic videos? Well, I've got 7 of them, and that video is going to start right now. Woo! Hey everybody, my name is Sean Seymour, and in this video I'm going to give you 7 cinematic settings, or 7 settings that will work in any camera that films video that you can use to turn your videos into a more cinematic look. The first setting that I want you to take a look at is resolution. If your camera will shoot it, change your resolution to 4K. Yes, it uses more memory, but memory cards are cheap, and big memory cards are cheap. You'll find that if you shoot in 4K, first of all, you'll be able to reframe. So let's say I wanted to bring this frame in and it'll go a little bit tighter or whatever. I wanted to move over this way or this way. I can do that in 4K without losing any resolution. Change it to 4K. And while you're changing it to 4K, tip number whatever it is going to talk about frame rate. We're going to get to that in just a second. The next thing I want you to look at is ISO. I always start with ISO 100 as my setting. That's going to give me the most clarity out of the camera. For those of you that don't know, it may seem like ISO just solves all your darkly lit challenges. Like if the room is too dark, just punch up the ISO. But you want to be careful of that because that tiny screen on the back of your camera probably makes it look great. But when you get it into your editing software or you publish it out, it's going to have a lot of noise in it. Start with your ISO at 100, and if you really need to, go up to maybe 400. Every camera has a sweet spot. It has a good spot to shoot from. So maybe ISO 100, 200 is fine, 400 is fine, but as soon as I punch 800, all of a sudden all the shadows have noise. Look for that sweet spot, test it, and see where your camera's limit is. ISO, low as you can get it. Ole! Hey everybody, my name is Sean Seymour, and I do videos about technology and photography. Sometimes it's cool stuff, sometimes it's frustrating stuff. Hopefully for you it's all new, and if it is, go ahead and hit that subscribe button down in the bottom right hand corner of your screen and join me for more of this kind of content. My number 3 tip is frame rate. It ties in a little bit to resolution because your camera settings are most likely going to have your frame rate and your resolution in the same spot. Your settings might look something like 4K 24 frames per second or 4K 60 frames per second. So those two are tied together as to where you're going to set them. Now I edit in 24 frames per second, and that means that I'm also going to shoot in 24 frames per second for my regular footage. I always shoot in 24 frames per second for regular, and I shoot in 60 frames per second for slow motion. When I slow it down, I'm going to shoot in 60 frames per second and then slow that down to 40% in my timeline when I edit it. I think in order for you to get a very nice cinematic video, you're going to want your frame rate to be 24 frames per second. A couple more things related to frame rate. Yes, you can adjust it during editing process, but you really want to shoot the frame rate with the thought in mind that you're going to either shoot regular or you're going to shoot slow motion. You don't want to try and do this in the editing process. You also don't want to shoot everything in 60 frames per second and slow it down later because you can actually tell. Fast or slow, always output your project in 24 frames per second unless there's a really good reason not to. My 4th tip is shutter speed. Controlling your shutter speed and using the correct shutter speed is really going to help that cinematic look in your videos. So I use my frame rate as the basis to calculate my shutter speed. The golden rule is you take your frame rate and multiply it times 2, and that should be your shutter speed. For example, if I'm shooting in 24 frames per second, my shutter speed should be 1/148th of a second. Now my camera doesn't go to 1/148th, so I have to use 1/50th of a second. Let me give you a better example that actually works mathematically. If I'm shooting 60 frames per second, my shutter speed is going to be 1/120th of a second, and that's going to be 2 times my frame rate. Unlike photography, you're not going to use your shutter speed to adjust the amount of light that hits your sensor. Your shutter speed is basically fixed depending upon your frames per second. So if I'm shooting in 24 frames per second and my shutter speed is 1/200th of a second, and I'm doing that because it's really bright outside, which, by the way, I'm going to give you a solution to that here shortly. What will happen is my video is going to look very digitalized. It's going to look really weird. Instead of it looking nice and flowy, you know, having that little bit of motion blur, and I keep doing this so you can see motion blur from my hands. Instead of it having that nice motion blur, which is what gives that cinematic look, it's going to look very digitalized. If you stick to that golden rule, you're going to have no trouble whatsoever with having that nice cinematic look to your videos. Okay, tip number 5. Nothing screams amateur or rookie video more than the white balance changing during the shot. You'll know right away when white balance changes because the color tone of everything in the background will change. What I want you to do is I want you to either set your white balance on custom and put it at 5500 Kelvin, or set your white balance on daylight and leave it. If you're using editing software, you can always adjust your white balance once you get it into your software. And as of right now, the making of this video, there's no way to natively set the white balance in an iPhone. I don't know if Android has it, but I know for fact that my iPhone does not allow me to use a custom white balance or a daylight white balance. It's actually auto white balance, and it does fluctuate while you're filming. So just keep that in mind. Set your white balance, forget it. Don't ever change it. Okay, let's briefly talk about tip number 6, which is aperture. Aperture controls the depth of field and the amount of light that comes into your camera. Many cameras, like the iPhone and GoPros, have a fixed aperture, so you're not going to change this setting on those particular cameras. Depth of field speaks to how much of the shot is in focus. So like you can see in my shot, my face is in focus, but my TV in the background is not in focus. And that's because I have a more shallow depth of field. A quick little note about depth of field and your aperture. The wider that your lens aperture is, the more shallow your depth of field. I have a great video on depth of field, and it literally goes into depth on depth of field. What I do is I use my aperture to create a shallow depth of field when I want to do a little bit more cinematic type stuff. Something to keep in mind is your aperture also controls the amount of light that comes into your camera, so you may need to adjust your ISO or do something different if you close down that lens and you've restricted the amount of light that's going into your camera. The opposite is true when you open up and you're trying to get a very shallow depth of field, but there's way too much light coming in. So how do you solve that problem? Well, that is tip number 7. They're called neutral density filters, or ND filters for short, and if you've ever shot outdoors, you're going to need them. The reason being is you might open up your aperture and you might be shooting at, say, 24 frames per second, so your shutter speed is only going to be 1/50th of a second, and that does not cut out very much light. Having a wide open aperture so you can shoot a shallow depth of field and your shutter speed is at 1/50th of a second. Right away you know that you're going to need to cut down some of the light and the way that it gets into your camera. Neutral density filters do just that. They typically attach to the front of your lens, and without changing the color balance, at least they're not supposed to, you should be able to filter out some of the light. Neutral density filters are typically rated on how dark they are and how much light they're removing or how much light they're not allowing to pass through. As we talked about earlier, some of your video settings are fixed, right? You can't change your frame rate, you can't change your shutter speed, and you can only go so low on your ISO, and if you want your aperture open, you're going to be gathering all kinds of light and you're going to be overexposing everything, especially if you're shooting outdoors. So a neutral density filter is the solution to how you cut down that light.
Hey, take a look at this video about neutral density filters. It explains everything you need to know about shooting outdoors, and I give you a suggestion about which neutral density filter to buy if you're only going to carry one in your bag. And on top of that, there is a free chart that shows you what neutral density filter you should be using, because as you know, all the charts out there online don't have anything for video. They all are related to photography. So take a look at this video. I think it'll be really helpful.
Okay, so there's 7 tips. I keep getting this wrong. There's 7 tips to help you with settings on your camera to create more cinematic videos. Put all that into play, and trust me, your camera, if it shoots in manual at all, will have these settings somewhere. I bet you money if you're editing in 24 frames per second and you're following some of these guidelines that I've given you, that you're gonna see a much, much different look to your videos than you did before. I hope you found this video helpful. If you did, hit that subscribe button down below and like my video, of course. And until I see you in the next video, my friend, keep it simple. What the hell is that shit? Are you going? All of a sudden the light turns off. Oh no, we're gonna have some issues with this one. I'm gonna get more creative than that. Hey everybody, my name, ooh, I need my towel. That was very interesting. Let's do this. Yellow towel. Wow, this is turning into a little harder than I thought. There we go. Oh, yes. And flash. Ooh. You can't really see the yellow towel that I threw behind me, can you? I don't know why that was bugging me. The towel was too close to me. 24 seconds. 24 frames per second. I can't help you in this video. That makes no sense at all. And that was about as cheesy as it gets. Oh my gosh.